Playwright is an end-to-end testing framework from Microsoft, and last year it got quite some momentum, and this year it almost caught up to Cypress. So in this video I want to give you a quick introduction into Playwright. We will first of all start with the setup, with the configuration. Then I will show you the basic things. So how can you select an element? How can you run some actions like typing something into a field or maybe clicking on a button? And of course also how to assert something. Then we will see how Playwright runs in the CI, what tools are there available also in terms of reporting. And then at the very end, I will give you some tips and tricks to make your life easier. So welcome to this video. My name is Rainer Hanekamp. I'm a trainer and consultant at Angular Architects. We provide workshops for Playwright, so Playwright and together with Angular testing, but also Playwright natively. Let's start. So the first thing that you have to do is, of course, that you have to install it. In my case, I have already an existing project and I want to integrate, I want to embed Playwright into it. So what do I have to do? Well, I have to say npm init playwright. You can also do this with an empty project. So if you want to have an end-to-end project where you more or less start from scratch. It takes some time. Then I'm getting some questions. In my case, I say, where do I want to put my end-to-end tests? I leave it with the default values. I also say I don't want to create any GitHub actions. By the way, if you want to run it in the CI, there are many available templates for GitHub, for GitLab, and all the other CIs that are available. Just check them out in the documentation. Yeah, and this is of course also very important. Playwright usually wants to install its own browsers. That does not mean that there are kind of customized browsers, but every Playwright version is linked to a specific browser version, and that's why Playwright by default wants to download them once. They will be stored globally, and from that location Playwright will then use those browsers. So we see it's already done. I'm not doing this for the first time, so my browsers have already been downloaded. If in your case it might be that the downloading will take quite some time. But what do we get? Well, the first thing is that if we look into our package.json, then you will see a Playwright. Where do we have it? Here it is, a Playwright test. Now Playwright as a library is it more or less has zero dependencies, more or less, almost. So if we look into our node modules, then we have here our Playwright package. And if we look into the package.json, then we see that it says in the dependencies, there is just Playwright there, nothing else. And this would more or less gone and gone, so not gone and gone. There is just Playwright. Where do we have it? No, there's quite a lot of dependencies there. That's usually the way how it is. No, there it is. So there is Playwright, and then Playwright has another dependency, and that's the last one to Playwright core. And if we look at the dependencies there, then we see it's empty. So Playwright is extremely dependency friendly, if this is actually a word. But for enterprises, this is actually a very important thing because we don't want to install Playwright and then 20 or 50 other dependencies. Playwright, it's very clear, it's just Playwright and nothing else. So, what about the configuration? So once you install it, you have a Playwright config. This is where you usually start with. You could more or less leave the configuration file almost with its default values. So we have here, for example, the test here. But what you should definitely change or modify is the base URL. So in my case, the default setting is 127.3,000. Since I will test an Angular application, I say it's running on localhost 4200. Then we also have here quite a bunch of projects. There are actually 3 of them. So by default, Playwright runs every test with 3 browsers. That's the Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit. Chromium should be clear. Firefox should also be clear. WebKit, is it Safari? Is it something else? WebKit is actually the engine that runs behind Safari. So we can't really use Safari in Playwright or by default, but we could run something which is called the Playwright browser that runs well, which internally is using WebKit. So in a way, we could say it is almost as if we would run Safari. But that's more or less the default. So every test runs 3 times with these browsers. Good. And then at the very end, which is something I would also recommend you, is that you enable the web server setting. What is this all about? Well, you usually have some kind of an application, especially, and this is very important when it comes to the development time, where I say in my case, well, npm run start starts up my application that I want to test, and Playwright can do this for you automatically. So in my case, I have to come up here with the right URL. So it's 4200. And then there is also another very nice setting where Playwright says, well, if you already run your application and it's reachable on 4200, then I don't have to do anything else. So this is more or less this kind of reuse existing browser, reuse existing server. And what we see here is always, or quite often, that there is this kind of CI. So Playwright differentiates between the CI mode and the development mode. So in the CI mode, you have to kind of come up with your own values. In the development mode, I would say you can mostly stick to the default ones. Something else which might be important there, yes, this fully parallel. So Playwright makes use of parallelization quite a bit. So it's very fast in that sense. But it doesn't just parallelize the tests via the files, but it also parallelizes tests which are inside of a file. So if you have a testing file which contains 5 different tests and you have the resources available, then Playwright could theoretically distribute 5 tests to 3 browsers, and it would be able to distribute it to 15 processes. So they will also run inside of a file, which is of course a little bit problematic if your test design does not allow parallel execution, because sometimes it happens that we have a test suite where we say there is one test case after another, and I would expect that they are executed in a sequential order. As long as they are within a file. If they are located in a separate file, it's a different story. But within a single file, I would expect that they run in sequential order. This will not be good if you run here fully parallel mode. So in that case, you have to set it to false, and then you have the sequential execution within a file. But in general, when it comes to multiple files, of course, the files will then, of course, be parallelized. Okay, is there something else we have to look for? Actually not. So far, this should be enough. Now we need to write our first test. So I have already started now my application just to showcase you what I actually want to test. So this is a typical Angular application. I have here an administration overview, and as you can see here, it's more or less like a CRUD functionality. So I have here a list of holidays, and I can click here on Add Holiday, which then allows me to enter a name, and then I say, well, Austria has mountains, so some kind of a holiday. Then I click on Save, and then we see the holiday shows up, and then I can obviously also edit it. So I can say has mountains and is flat as well, for example. If I save it, then we see here it shows up with the updated description. And if I go back and I say I want to delete it, then it's more or less also removed once I reload it. Good. So how can we now test this application with Playwright? So first of all, I'm going to shut down my application, because if you remember from my configuration, I have told Playwright to run the web server, to run the application if it's not available. So what I usually do is that I go into my package.json and that I set up a script. So I say here, this is the end-to-end, and that one means I want to run it in development mode. And that means in my case, Playwright test --UI. This is the modern way, how I like to call it. We will then also take a look at the older way on how to test Playwright, but let's start more or less with the modern way. So I run the script. Remember, the application is not running. Now you see here the message coming from Playwright. It starts up my application. It waits until it is reachable. And then, which is exactly now, it starts up the Playwright UI. So this is what we have here in front of us. That's the test runner. There are already some tests coming from the initial setup, so I will more or less remove them because we want to start from scratch. So we have here end-to-end. This is our folder. I'm going to remove it, and I will say I want to create my own test. So I say here, okay, admin spec ts. That's usually the file extension that you should use. How does Playwright actually work? Well, in the end, it's a remote control for a browser. So since Playwright has already downloaded all the 3 browsers, as you have seen in the beginning, it is also able to kind of start them and to remotely control them. And of course, we need to provide the code so that Playwright knows what we actually want to do or what the browser should actually do. So when we want to write a test, a good starting point might be to write a test, just a function like this. That's also, of course, the name of the function from Playwright. And if you want to kind of generate a test suite, then you should say describe. So test describe means I'm defining now a test suite which will contain multiple test cases. I will only write one. So I say here that's the holidays administration, and then comes my function, and my test would be again with the function test, but now I'm not calling method, but I'm calling test as a function, and there I say test adding a new holiday. That's the name of the test, and then I also have my testing function, which is usually asynchronous. And let me quickly finish it. And what you usually get is that Playwright provides you with a so-called page object. This page object gives you access to the browser. So I could now, with the page, I can already control my browser. And what we usually do is that we have to open our application first. So that's always the first step. So I say here go to, that's the command to navigate to my application. And since Playwright already knows the URL of my application, I only have to provide here an empty string. That is enough, almost, because everything in Playwright, or almost all commands, are asynchronous. So I have to say here await. That is important. And once I have done that, I'm going to save the file. And in the background, I can now go to my Playwright test runner, and we see that it says here already, well, holidays administration, there is a test suite already available, and there is adding a new holiday. We see here all that there is a project option where I can more or less define all the browsers that should be used, and I even have dark mode available, which is something that I don't want to use. Good. We can start the test by just clicking here on run. Now Playwright will open our application. We see its screen. So we have here then an overview of more or less of every test per browser. And since we haven't done anything, we see here more or less, we see something, it's the application, but it's empty. This is actually what we told Playwright. Just open our application and don't do anything else. Good. So the next step would be that we, in a way, have to select a certain element. Let me quickly go back to my application because it now runs again. That's usually how the application looks like if it has been fully loaded. In Playwright, we didn't really say when Playwright should stop. We actually just told Playwright, open the page and don't do anything else. So Playwright actually did that and then stopped. So that's why we actually never saw the menu there and the content. But we know that we want to click on something, on a button, or actually in this case, it is a link with the name administration. So how do we select something in Playwright? We have our page available, and the basic selector function is the locator. The locator expects or can kind of process different so-called selector engines, but in general, we want to go with the CSS selector. So we want to select our elements as we would normally also do it in a CSS file. It's actually a very common technique that we also find in other testing frameworks. So in my case, I would say, okay, I want to select now, I don't know, a link or something like this. But what I always like to do and what I also recommend is that we have to choose between one of two different approaches. One is the so-called data test ID approach, and the other one is the so-called user-facing approach. We will start with the data test ID approach. So I say there is somewhere, or all my elements, they are equipped with a so-called data test ID attribute, and I want to use that for my selection mechanism. So if we take a look at the side menu, for example, then we see what I mean. We have here a data test ID within all links, and for the administration, the value for it is button admin. Good. Now I can say, okay, that's actually the attribute is data test ID. So that's why I use here the brackets. And then I say the value of it is button admin. And again, this is an asynchronous function. So if I just write it synchronously, it will not do anything. So I have to do something. I could say, kind of wait for it. And now there are not so many options, but one of them is maybe click. Because this is what I actually want to do with the button. I want to click on it. Let's see what happens. So I kind of switch over to Playwright. And now, as you see, Playwright has a watcher mode included, which means when it sees that a test has changed, it immediately starts it. And by the way, looking at the times, I mean, they're all running in parallel already, but I don't, especially in the development mode, I don't really see a need that I use all three browsers at once. So let me quickly kick out Firefox and WebKit. We will, of course, use it then in the CI, but for the development mode, I would say it's not necessary. Right. Yeah, and now we see a little bit more. So we can now take a look at the other elements of this UI mode or of this test runner that we have here in front of us. So first of all, this kind of click is shown here by highlighting the actual element. And then we also see here the red dot, which kind of shows me the position where the mouse click has actually happened. At the very top, we have something like a timeline. So I could hover here with my mouse over it, and I see how the application changed over time. Very useful. Unfortunately, the main screen here right in the middle is not really interactive. So it's more or less a screenshot from the last command that Playwright executed, which means I can't click on holidays. It doesn't do anything. It's almost a screenshot. And at the very bottom, we have very useful information, which we might not need all the time, but it's good to know that it does exist. So we have here, for example, the source. This is the test source. Okay. We have here something like call, so we get here some kind of detailed information. We also have here a logging, which is very important when we have errors inside of our tests. By the way, the errors are shown here as well. Then we have here console, and then we also have here an overview of the network. So if we ever want to mock or kind of stop a particular network request, which is something I'm not going to do now in this video, but I'm just telling you it is actually very easy to do, then you're getting the information of the network communication from the test runner. For me, it is more or less important that I need to make sure that after I've clicked on administration, that I more or less see this list here, the list of the holidays. So I now need to come up with some kind of verification or assertion. What could that be? Well, I could, for example, say there should be a button with the name add holiday, or I could go again with the data test ID. In my case, if we open the dev tools, then we would see that there is actually a data test ID at the rows available. And in my case, that's the row holiday. So I can say, yes, this is the one that I like. I'm going to use row holiday. Good. So by the way, we have already selectors and actions because the click was already the action. So we can already select elements and interact with them as well. And now comes the assertion. Because now I say, okay, page locator again, data test ID is row holiday. And maybe I want to verify now that there are two of them. So I say when I click on this administration button, I would expect that the two rows more or less show up. So I need an expect. So I place this locator into an expect. I also need to import this expect. And then I say here, await. That's also important. You do it always outside, not inside of the expect. And then the expect, of course, says, yeah, what do you actually expect? And here I say, well, I would expect that we have here a count of those elements, and the count should be 2. This is what I'm going to expect. I can go back. Playwright will restart the tests, and the tests are already finished. And we see here that the 2 rows are also highlighted, because Playwright says this is exactly what you were actually looking for. So how does this work behind the curtain? So, or maybe is there a problem with kind of time condition or race condition or something like this? Usually, I mean, if we have here everywhere asynchronous tasks, then Playwright has, of course, waiting features built in. So Playwright is very stable, even for very slow applications. There are some timeouts included where Playwright would say, of course, if, I don't know, if the element doesn't show up within 5 seconds, then I will let the test fail, but you still can override this kind of behavior. But there are some default settings in place. But either way, Playwright will wait. So if your browser needs to fetch something from the backend first, or if some rendering happens, Playwright will wait for it, and you will more or less have very stable tests, let's put it like this. Because with other testing frameworks, that was always a little bit of a challenge, but with Playwright, we are actually in a very good position when it comes to stable, when it comes to non-flaky tests. That's more or less the word that we use for this kind of behavior. Good. So now we can now more or less verify that holidays are shown. What do we want to do next? Well, I want to add a new holiday. In Playwright, we have a locator. So this is what you see here. There is a symbol where I can say pick locator. And if I click on it, I can hover with my mouse over different elements. And as you see here, for example, if I say here add holiday, then I'm getting here a little bit of a suggestion of my locator. Strangely, this doesn't say locate, page locate, but it says get by role. And if you remember, I told you before that there are different kind of approaches. We could go via the test ID, or we can also go via the user-facing ones. And this is a user-facing selector which we see here, which also goes via accessibility roles. Because what we say here, or what Playwright is actually suggesting to us, that it says what you want to select is a link. So you want to select an element of type link, which has the name add holiday inside of it. This is how your users would normally interact with your website. So your end users, they will not look for data test IDs. They will look for the type of the element and also for its name. So I say here, okay, good choice. Let's go with that one. Let's go with get by role. So I'm going to copy it and then more or less can paste it here. The question now, of course, is where does this get by role come from? It doesn't come from the testing library. It comes from the page. So page has also a property get by role. If you're interested, the page also has, it actually has quite a lot of getter methods. There is even a get by test ID. So what this means is that I don't have to write here button or data, don't have to write here data test ID all the time. What I could also do is that I just say get by test ID like this and only provide the value of the test ID. This would also work. But in my case, I say, okay, we want to go with this kind of user-facing selectors. It's also nice if we, in a way, can interact with our website, also in terms of accessibility issues that we also cover them. So let's go with that one, with that approach. The get by role and all the other getters internally are just calling the same locator that we have already used or that is still used here. It's more or less the same. It's just a syntactic sugar or however you want to call it. It's a shortcut. Good, so I say again, I want to click on this. And then we know already what will happen. It will click on the button, but unfortunately in our test runner, we will not see what happens afterwards because it will stop right after the click. Let's check out if that's really the case. So the test reruns, test is successful. And as I said, we have here the add holiday. We don't see the form that should come more or less afterwards. I mean, you have here a before, you also have here an after. Oh, and by the way, there it is. This is always a little bit tricky. Sometimes it might work, sometimes it might not work. Because depending on the speed of your application, it could be, as it was here, that the next page shows up very quickly. But if you have, I don't know, some kind of criteria where say, okay, you are now navigating to another page and the application more or less is now waiting for a request, which might take some time until it finally or eventually renders the component, then it could be the case that you don't see here anything when you click on after. But in our case, we were lucky. So we see already, yes, there are some form fields available with the labels name and description. To be honest, I was not expecting that, so I'm also very positively surprised. Usually I always run an API against my application, so it does take some time, but here this application runs in memory, so the switch actually happens quite fast. Good. So since we now know already what the next steps will be, we can of course again use the locator if we want to. So in this case, the locator is now recommending the get by test ID. But yeah, let me tell you, there is also another one. We can still go via the role, or maybe not via the role, but via the label, because I'm using here Angular material. They are extremely good when it comes to accessibility, and the label for those text fields are name and description. And please also remember, we have here a save, in this case, save button. In this case, the locator shows me the right selector. So we need to come up with 3 commands now. So I say page, I say get by label. This is one of those selectors which we have. We know that the label is more or less name, and then we say we want to type something in. There is a type, but that one is, as you see, it's deprecated. There is a better one, which is called fill. What fill does is that it clears the content of the text field that it had before, and then it more or less overrides it with the value that you provide now. So I say here, Austria. Of course, I also need to await it. And then I also come up with my description. So I say here description, and I say Austria has mountains. Yeah. And of course, then I also want to click on the button. So I say here again, await page, get by role this time, because I know it is a button, and the button has the name save in it, and this is something that I want to click on. So you see, in general, it's actually very easy to write tests in Playwright. There are not so many commands that you need to remember. I think if you sit down for a couple of hours, then you are already fully more or less prepared and can write the majority of your end-to-end tests. So it's not really complicated. It's very developer friendly. We can actually now continue, because if we say, well, if everything goes as we would expect, then the save would more or less navigate us back to our overview, which now means that we should now have a holiday count of 2 or actually of 3. So I say here, okay, I'm going to copy it, and I say here, now I would expect that it more or less 3. But what you should, of course, always do with whenever you write a test, you should let your test fail first. And this is exactly what I'm doing now, because now I would expect that this test fails because I have 3 rows and not 2. Yeah, Playwright starts. We see now it is waiting. We are already at the expect. So there is some timeout where Playwright gives the application enough time to render the right result, more or less. But in our case, the application doesn't change anything. So it will be just 3 elements there and not just 2. And that's why we can now say, okay, this test in a way is more or less working. Right. In the same way, you could now continue. So you could now more or less, also say here you want to edit it. Then you need to click on the button. You can also then say you want to delete it. It's more or less always the same. Maybe some commands, maybe a combination of the locators which are necessary. But in the end, the majority of your test code looks like this. Now, let's take a look at another way on how we can use Playwright the old way. which is actually not something which I would say you don't need it. It is very useful when you have tests that don't run as you expect and you need to come up with some kind of debuggability or debugging features. The old way works with VSCode because that's an extension for VSCode that we have. So let me switch over to VSCode. So here we are in VSCode and I have already the extensions installed. So there is just one extension for Playwright, which is the official one coming from Microsoft. So that's the one that you have to install. And once you have done that, then you get here the testing icon where you see already the existing Playwright tests. So in my case, I say, okay, we have here again our holidays administration, and you see here a button which allows me to actually start a test right from the IDE. I can even add here a breakpoint if I want to. So I can say, okay, maybe I want to, maybe not here, but maybe I want to stop at the very end before the last command is actually executed, and I want to debug it. So I click here on debug test. Now internally, Playwright starts without the UI mode, but it will start the browser, which I more or less will see in a couple of seconds. And then, well, let's just wait first. Yeah. So here's our browser. Let me quickly make this here a little bit smaller. And as I said, this is now the debug mode. So it really stops right here. We have access to everything which the debugging mode in VS Code provides you. So we see here the page, we also see the closure, the globals, and more or less what you are used to. And the nice thing is, it's not just the debugging, but it's really interactive. Because if I'm going to change something now in my source code, so if I say here, if I click, I just need to click here on this kind of line of code where it says data test row ID, row holiday, then you see that in the browser, automatically, the holiday rows are highlighted. And I can go to another one, to another line, maybe button admin. And if I click on it, then you see it also. It now is highlighting actually this button here. And if I'm going to change here something, so if I say here button customers, then all of a sudden it is highlighting the DOM elements which would be selected by button customers. So this is very good. It really allows you to interactively develop your tests. And you also have something. You have here an interactive web application, which you don't have in the UI mode. Because I can also click here on some things, and it's not just the screenshots. It's the really working browser that we have here right in front of us. If you ask yourself what you should use, I mean, I would say the UI mode is the one which, as I said in the beginning, that's the modern version, that's the modern mode in Playwright. It's a little bit young. The VS Code extension is very old. That's also why it can do quite a lot of stuff. But if we look at the evolution of the UI mode, we see that Playwright adds new features with every version. So I would start these days with the UI mode. And if you really have some issues with your tests, maybe you want to fall back only for that particular case to VS Code, which gives you more possibilities in terms of debugging. Speaking of testing of failed tests, how does this look like in the CI? So if I run my test in the CI, I don't see anything. I mean, it runs, I don't know, in the middle of the night or some other time. But how can we find out if something has broken or what the actual root cause is? Well, let me quickly close this again. We can run Playwright in the CI mode as well. It's actually very easy. We just have to say npx playwright test. This will now, of course, run the holidays administration. It will, of course, also start now my web server, as we see. And you see here that Playwright is already telling me I am starting 3 different browsers. So where do we have it? Oh, here it is. I'm starting 3 different worker processes. So I'm going to parallelize them. You only have 1 test, but you have enabled 3 browsers. So that's why it's 3 worker processes. But what happens now if something fails? So what happens if the to have count here is not 3, but maybe 2? Let's rerun our tests. So usually in that case, when you do this always via the command line, it's not so good because Playwright always has to start the application at first, and then it only then starts with the testing. So in that case, it would be better if the application is already running and Playwright only needs to start its own tests. Yeah. So here is what we get more or less when any error happens. This is the report. This is the HTML report. Playwright also has different reporters available. That's the default one. And if we click on one of them, then we see, of course, here what more or less went wrong. So the reason here is it waited for 5 seconds that only 2 holiday rows show up, which didn't happen, and that's why the test more or less failed. That's nice. That's very nice what we see here, but it's not enough. I want to have more. And Playwright has more. So in Playwright, in the configuration, you have here a setting that says trace. So what usually happens when you run Playwright in the CI mode, then it has a retry of 2. So once the first test fails, it retries it another time or so, 2 times more or less. And if it fails on the first retry again, then Playwright is creating a trace view and is also storing it. In my case, in development mode, I don't want to run it. I don't want to have this retry there. So I say store the trace already on the first time. So I say here retain on failure. That's the value for it. And if I now rerun my tests again, then we will see that obviously they will fail again, but we will get a better report. Let's wait and see. Okay, so the tests have failed again, and if I open them now, then we see again the same report, but at the very bottom, we see here traces. And if I click on that, then I see more or less what I would have seen in my Playwright test runner as well. So I have here again this kind of timeline where I see how the application changed over time. I see here all my test commands. I have my screenshots available. I have my logging available, for example, also the network, the errors. I could even use the locator if I want to. Even that one works. So with the trace view, Playwright gives you everything that it can in order to help you to find out what the root cause actually was. So this is something which you get for free. You only need to enable it in the configuration. Then you can let Playwright run in the CI. And if something fails, then you will get this report. So the last thing that I want to show you are the so-called test fixtures. This is a way on how you can organize your code a little bit. If we now think a little bit and say, okay, yeah, maybe I will have multiple tests where I'm kind of interacting with this holidays form, then I don't want to repeat this get by label all the time. I just want to centralize it. I want to have one function that I can call, and this function knows exactly what the selector is and what command has to be executed. I mean, it's not so hard, it's just a fill, but this is something that I want to have in this function. And if I need to change it at some time later, then there is this function where I only have to do this change once. So Playwright helps you now a little bit because Playwright supports the so-called page object pattern. What does that mean? That means that you kind of group functionalities like filling in some kind of form fields into a class, into an object, which is called the page object, and that object then contains all the logic for that particular page, or in our case, the component. So if I say holidays form is a candidate for such a component, then how would this look like? You could come up, I create here a new object, a new directory where I say, well, this is page object, and then I create there a file, which I say that's the holiday form TS. The holiday form is a class. It has a constructor where it says, I want to have the page, because I will now know how to fill into the form fields. And because of that, we have then a function which has set name. It would expect the name as a string, and it would then more or less execute this command that we have here in our actual test. So I'm going to copy this, adding it here, and of course I also would then do the same for the description. So I would then say here I also have a description, set description, and it is obviously this page, and because I want to use the await again, I need to make both functions asynchronous. Here it's description, and of course the value comes from the parameter. So this is name here, and here it is description. So that's the form. That's the form class. How can I use it? Well, we could. This doesn't mean that this is already how we end up with, but we could say we have here our holiday form that we are going to instantiate inside of the test. So I say your holiday form, we provide the page to it, and then instead of saying name fill, I only say, okay, holiday form, set name, it is Austria. You could even come up here with the Fluent API where the set name returns you the holiday form again. I'm not a fan of it, but you could do it if you want to. And then you can also see a description where I say Austria has mountains and is also flat, not just mountains there. Yeah, so this is the way how it would look more or less. And then of course you would continue to do the same thing also for your other components. So for example, for my list where the holidays are shown, I would come up with a holidays page object or something similar. The problem now is that I have to instantiate this page object all the time. And of course, if I have now multiple ones, then this becomes even much more code than it is now. And there, Playwright again helps you with a concept or with a functionality which is called test fixtures. Test fixtures allow you that the holidays form are automatically available when you call the test. So what I mean is that in a test you can say I want to have the holiday form already more or less injected and I don't want to instantiate it. How does this work? It works a little bit complicated because what you have to do is that you have to extend the test object. So you would have to say here test extend, and you extend it then with, so you have your fixtures, and there you define those kind of types that your test fixtures should provide. So in my case, I say the holiday form should be the one that should be provided. This property should be an asynchronous task, an asynchronous function again. So I say here asynchronous function. It will have the same parameter that your normal test has, which means you get access to the page here. And then very important, it has an init or use or however you want to call it. Let's call it use. And what you have to do now is that you first of all instantiate your page object. So I would say here, this one goes now here. And then you call the use. So you say here, use holiday form. Which means now that you can now take this kind of test extension and use it instead of this test here. It's the same test command, it's the same test object, but it has in addition the holiday form that the test can now access as well. So the way how you usually do this is that you, of course, that you take this one and that you again move it to a separate file. So I say here, okay, I have here a new file, which is called test.ts. And here I'm going to say, I'm going to export. What do I want to export? Actually, the test again, which is not really working. And there we usually go with an alias. So I say here, the original test is something I want to call now base. So I say here, I'm going to extend the base actually, and I'm going then to export a new variable, which is then called test. Because I don't want that in my test files that there is then base describe and base whatever. I want to stick to the test name. Then here we also have to do something, or do we actually have to do something? I don't think so. That looks correct. And now we have to make use of it. So I'm going back into my test, and instead of saying, well, the test comes from Playwright test, I now have to say, well, this test now comes from my test file. And you see, we have now the holiday form here available. It's not ending up in a compilation error anymore. The problem though is that the holiday form here is still of type any. And this is something that I also want to fix. So I go back to my test and I say here, well, this kind of extend will provide me with a holiday form of the type holiday form. So now this is more or less also typed. And if I now go back, then we see that now the holiday form again has the right value, has the right type, and now everything is as it should be. And by applying this kind of fixtures, I have a kind of provided way by Playwright how I can organize my code and how I can really scale in terms of amount of tests. Because as you have seen, Playwright is very fast with this parallelization feature that they have built in. You can have quite a lot of tests before you run into a timing issue. Last but not least, there is something else I want to show you. You have also the possibility to generate that code, that testing code. There exists a code generator by Playwright, but I always go with the one of Chromium itself. So Chromium has here this recorder function. And well, you can say I want to create a new recording, then you just click on create new recording, say start recording, and then you do whatever you want to do. So in my case, I say, okay, I want to go to administration. I want to add a holiday. I want to say Austria. Austria has mountains. Then I want to save it. And then I would say, okay, that's enough for now. Let's take a look what code we would more or less get. And if you scroll into the top in the browser, you see here a button show code. It's a little bit hidden. You have to really scroll to the top. And if you click on show code, then you have here an extension. So this is something that you have to install, but there is a Playwright extension for the Chromium recorder. And that one gives you a start. Let's say it's a start. It is of course not something where I would say I would use it for my tests or I would leave it as it is. It's a template. So this is something I can copy. I can then integrate into my tests. Of course, I also have to come up then with the fixtures and all that stuff. But in the end, this is a very good way when you have manual testers or somebody who might not be able to code in that case, that you just go to that person and say, look, recode whatever you usually check. And then I will have a template that, of course, is then something that I can then improve. All right, so I hope I could give you a nice overview of Playwright. It was more or less scratching the surface, but as I said in the beginning, we are providing workshops for Playwright. So if you're interested, check out our website. There you will find the latest states. And by the way, I also did a comparison between Cypress and Playwright. So this might also be worth checking out. And as always, if you have any questions, any comments, then please write it into the section below. If you like this video, please give it a like. I would also be happy if you subscribe to my channel. And yeah, thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye.